Okay, let us kick this off. If everyone is ready, I see there's a number of people in here already. I'm sure we will have some more joining us. Hello, Sharon. Good morning to you. Just seeing the first question here, Mother. Will a person who happens to be addicted easily put out substance abuse? That is a complicated question to answer, and I hope that by the end of this webinar, you will have some insight into that. It's a very good question, and it talks a little bit about the dependency nature of substances, the chemical hooks that are there. How possible is it to stop abusing substance or stop being dependent on a substance? These two things. Yes, yeah, good, Sharon. I'm well, thank you as well. Hi, Anne-Marie, and hi, Desiree. Welcome to you, ladies, as well. It's great to have you guys all here. We're going to be speaking a bit about substance dependence today. So as I mentioned, this is our last webinar for the year. The general thrust has been on employability, but really my contribution to that is to speak a little bit about our own emotional well-being, psychological wellness. How do we maximize that to give us a bit of an edge in the different spheres of our lives? And one thing that can get in the way, often we can pay a significant price for, and we see people's lives getting derailed, is substance dependence. So we're going to speak a little bit about that. I'm going to take you through the classic story of addiction as it has been told for many decades. And then I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that as well. And I'm going to introduce you to some of the science and introduce you to some thinkers on these topics, and allow you then to hopefully walk away from this webinar just with a bit of a slightly different take on what it means to be dependent on a substance, what it means to also help people in your lives who are dependent, and how to help ourselves as well. And hopefully there'll be a fuller understanding of what's going on psychologically in these situations. So I'm going to take you through, as I say, just the basics, and then a little bit of an introduction to the work of three different experts in the field, and I'll introduce them as we go. And if you are interested in their work or challenged by anything or disagree with anything that I'm saying, look them up yourself. And there's, their works there. They've all written books and all have a big body of work behind them, so you can look at that as well. But that'll make more sense as we get through this. So as always, I hope that we can be interactive. I understand it's not easy to do necessarily with this forum, but should you have any questions or comments as we go, please feel free to put them in the chat. Raise your hand, and we will give you the floor. And if you would like to save it for the end as well, we can do so. But I will be keeping an eye on the chat as we go, so please feel free to put in any relevant comments, or if you'd like to just jump into the conversation. Some of what you hear today will probably challenge some of your beliefs, and I think that normally is a good thing. So yeah, let's take it from there. So if we're talking about addiction, we essentially are talking about a number of common properties. Firstly is craving. So a craving refers to this need, this deep urge we have to engage in the substance or the behavior. This deep urge that we feel, and like an itch that needs to be scratched. Any type of addiction typically comes with craving, but also comes with use. Engaging in the addictive substance or behavior. And normally this has something to do with experiencing pleasure. There's often some type of euphoric experience that comes with substances or behaviors that we start to become dependent on, or it might be avoidance of pain, temporary relief from pain. So this is often what is described as Freud's pleasure principle. Freud, and those of you I'm sure will be familiar with Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. His theory, one of his theories, was we have a so-called pleasure principle, which is, as human beings, we have this drive towards things that are pleasurable, psychologically as well, so in terms of thoughts, and we have an avoidance of pain. This is a physiological thing. We're more likely to move away from a hot stove as opposed to touch it. But also psychologically, we're more likely to move away from painful thoughts, painful memories, feelings, and more likely to gravitate towards things that are going to give us some type of high or euphoric feeling buzz. This is the pleasure principle. And this is often what's happening in substance abuse as well, is that it is a very effective way of not necessarily feeling stress or unhappiness or any type of psychic discomfort. And another aspect is that we typically pay a price for using the substance behavior. It's not completely free. And often when in more extreme cases of dependence, that price becomes increasingly higher. It might be a price to our relationships. It might be a financial cost we're paying. It might be professional costs where you get high functioning addicts, alcoholics, for example. They're able to use alcohol on a level that is very damaging to their psychological and physical health, but they're still able to show up in their relationship and do enough of a job that they don't necessarily get fired. For most people, that's not the case. As substance use starts to take over, it tends to start being increasingly expensive, not just financially, but any type of cost that we might pay. And then the inability to just give up a substance or behavior. So the inability just to say, I'm paying too much of a price for this, let me walk away. And this is often when we start talking about dependence. A lot of people will be able to use a substance, for example, and then start to say, okay, well, the price for this is probably going to be too high. You might think about this for, having a glass of whiskey in the morning. You wake up and you have really stressful day ahead of you. You think, well, do I want to do this or do I want to go out and put my sorrows away? Most people are able to say, okay, well, I recognize that just drinking my sorrows away is going to come at such a significant price. By the end of the day, by tomorrow, I'm probably not going to have a job. And my life is going to be in all sorts of chaos, and so I choose not to. With severe substance dependence, that choice becomes much, much harder to make. And people start making choices that are very self-defeating and very self-destructive and counterproductive. And they're unable to, the price they're paying is not enough of a deterrent to change the behavior. These are some of the key components of addiction. There is a DSM diagnosis for substance use. DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, often referred to as the Bible of diagnoses, the Bible of psychiatry, psychology, where every diagnosis that you've heard of or that you haven't heard of is in this, and it's often they're often quite contested, and it's changed over time. As you see, we're up to the DSM-5, and it's the fifth edition of this manual. This is how professionals find the criteria to make diagnoses. So there's a kind of common international shared vocabulary and diagnostic tool for psychiatry. So the previous DSM, DSM-4, had two different substance use disorders. So they had substance abuse and substance dependence. These were seen as different things. So abusing a substance doesn't necessarily mean I'm dependent on it, but if I'm dependent on it, that will often come with abuse, but not necessarily. So that they kind of differentiated. In the DSM-5, they amalgamated them into one, which is called the substance use disorder. So this is the only diagnosis one can have right now if you are in any type of substance dependence. And this is what it looks like. I'll take you through some of the diagnostic criteria. It doesn't matter so much, but rather just to give you a bit of background as to what we're looking at here. So there's a number of different symptoms that you might have. So number one, if you are using more of the substance than you intended or using it for longer than you're meant to, so there's not necessarily a control over dose and frequency. There's a gap between what you would like to be using and how much you're using. That's the first one. If you try to cut down or stop using the substance, but find that you're unable to do this, that's also an indication of substance use disorder. And you'll see in the next slide, you'll have to qualify for a number of these to get a certain category of diagnosis. It's not to say that just one means that you would rise to the level of the diagnosis of substance use disorder. You might experience intense cravings or urges to use the substance. As I said, that's one of the key components of addiction. And needing more of the substance to get the same effect. So this is tolerance over time. And you can see this with any type of substance. Coffee is one of those. You might find that if you don't have coffee for a number of days and you have coffee, you get a feeling kick out of it. If you're drinking 6 cups a day, you're probably likely to get less of an effect and need more of it to get the same type of effect. This is physiological response, neurological response, called tolerance. Developing withdrawal symptoms when you're not using the substance. This happens with many substances. It doesn't happen with a lot of the kind of so-called harder drugs. It does with some of them, but a lot of them there's not significant not significant withdrawals, such as things like psilocybin, MDMA, but with withdrawal from something like alcohol, that can be fatal. So people can die from withdrawal symptoms from alcohol if they were using a significant amount and suddenly cut it out completely. Spending more time getting and using the drugs, really a lot of your attention is focused on getting it. Your life is really revolves around the use and recovering from use as well. So what is my next day? What is my next few days of life? I'm kind of plan around it. And then neglecting responsibilities at home, work, or school because of substance use, the price that I was talking about, the price that we tend to pay. And then continuing to use it even when that price becomes higher. So when we notice we're having problems in our relationship, no romantic, family, personal, professional relationships, but yet we continue to use it. Giving up important or desirable social and recreational activities to do substance use, and using these risky settings that actually start with behavior. So you might recognize some of these in yourself. You might recognize that some of them in other people. Just because you have one or two doesn't mean, again, you would rise to the level of a diagnosis of substance use disorder, but it gives you a bit of an idea of what we're looking at. And finally, continuing to use despite the substance problems to your physical health. Again, one of the costs that would come with a use of a certain substance. So if you had one of these, you would then say that you would then say this is a risk factor, but not necessarily substance use disorder. If you had 2 or 3, this might point to mild substance use disorder, so that would be a mild diagnosis. 4 or 5 of these 11, this is moderate, and then 6 or more indicate a severe substance use disorder, which signals addiction. Interestingly, the prevalence of SUD is about 2% of the global population. So that's relatively high, depending how you frame it. It's higher than things like schizophrenia and other personality disorders, but lower than mood disorders such as depression and anxiety. The 2% is quite a substantial amount of people, of course. So there is a classical story of addiction that is kind of coming up as I speak about these things, as we speak about diagnosis, as we speak about the common components of addiction. There's this classic story of addiction that most people probably have in their heads. It goes a little something like this. Drugs have chemical hooks that lead to dependency. There's something in drugs that is so addictive that should you take it, you are very likely to become addicted. So if you give someone heroin, the heroin is so addictive that the likelihood of someone getting addicted, if they were to use for a period of time, is very high. This is the classic story. So this historically is seen as perhaps a moral failing. This is the more right-wing view, is that people with weak willpower or low moral standards, they will go for drug use. On the more left side of the continuum, and the more liberal side, it's seen as a disease of the brain. So actually, they actually have no control over these things. This is just a purely biological component. But if you subject these people to these substances, they will become addicted. Problem with this theory of addiction is that it doesn't account for the vast numbers of people who use substances but don't develop any type of dependence. So the statistics are somewhere around 10 to 20% of people who use substances will actually become dependent on them. So if we're looking at any theory and it only explains 1 out of 10, maybe 2 out of 10 of the people who are partaking, that says there's something missing in that theory, right? Because if there was something just naturally chemically addictive about these substances, then you would expect that number to be much, much higher. You would expect it to be closer to 100%, but even 70% might start to provide some backing for that theory. So, okay, well, yes, there is actually, the main story here is to be found in the chemical addiction of these substances. So when I have cocaine, there's something about that is so powerful to my brain that I start to crave it just because of the biological chemical process that's going on there. But of course, for most people, that's not happening. And that then raises interesting questions. It also doesn't explain how behavioral dependencies look almost identical to pharmacological dependencies, neurologically and psychologically. So behavioral dependencies are dependencies such as gambling, shopping, or anything that we're doing behaviorally that's not necessarily ingesting substance. This is really interesting because we see the same patterns. It looks the same. The type of dependencies, the type of craving spirals, withdrawal as well. We can see a lot of very similar, if not identical, types of neurological and psychological patterns going on. So this again says there's something that's not quite being explained by just this idea that addiction is its chemical hook. The very addictive substances, if you take them, you're likely to get hooked on them. And this is the story that's been told for a long time, but the science doesn't really back it up. So we're going to spend some time exploring that and seeing, well, psychologically, what is it that's happening? Maybe these dependencies are happening more on a psychological level than they are on a neurological level. I hope that distinction makes sense. Maybe they're happening more in terms of our mind and our consciousness and what it's like to be us, as opposed to these more basic biological processes that if we take substance A, we will become hooked on it. Okay, so the first of the three experts I'm going to take you through is probably the most controversial of the lot. This is not necessarily it's not necessarily an endorsement of his views, but rather just to give you his views to understand that this is what science is looking like at the moment. And as you'll see, there are some caveat tendencies, but essentially, this is the work of Dr. Cole Hart. And again, if you're interested in this, you can look it up. He does really good interviews, some good talks. He's got a book as well. He's an American psychologist, so trained psychologist at Columbia University, very prestigious university in the States. His book is called Drug Use for Grown-Up, which might give you a little bit of a clue on where he comes from, this debate. So his theory is something along the lines of most of what you think about drugs are wrong. So if you have this idea that drugs are these inherently very addictive substances and people are just going to use them and start becoming dependent, he says that is absolutely wrong. And he is he's quite a unrepentant heroin user, which is very interesting for a American psychologist, especially at a university such as Columbia. He says he uses it, but very much very mindful about the way he does it. He uses a number of different drugs. He has a lab as well that he uses. His theory is not coming just from his own personal experiences, but rather the work that he's been doing in his lab. So his theory is most of what you think about drugs are wrong. Most people are able of making rational choices about whether they use a substance or not. So another way of saying this, most people don't become dependent. This again is backed up by the numbers. And some of the experiments he's done is you give people money and you either offer them the substance or you offer them just a small amount of money. And most people are able to make rational choices about that and choose not to take the substance, depending on what their day looks like, depending on what their responsibilities are, that most people would choose to take the money as opposed to engaging in a substance that they have been using over time. He says, and this is something that kind of comes up, but probably a little bit less controversial, is the focus should be less on the drug itself and more on what is happening in that person's life. Because clearly there is such a thing as dependency, as we've spoken about it now. Clearly these things exist. You guys in this webinar, you would have been familiar with them either on a personal level or observing them in people in your life. There is such a thing as dependency, but maybe this is slightly different from addiction. So the focus then, according to Dr. Hart, is what is happening in that person's psyche? What is it like to be them? What is happening psychologically that might be leading to these types of self-defeating behaviors? So, of course, tolerance and withdrawal, these are real biological phenomena. We know that they exist, that if you take any type of substance, it's very likely that over time you need more of that substance to get the same result. As tolerance. Withdrawal just means that our bodies become dependent on the substances that are put into them, and if we suddenly stop, we often experience symptoms. In the case of coffee use, it might be headaches. In the case of alcohol, it might be shakes and fevers and deliriums. These are real, but they're not the same as addiction. There's a distinction between tolerance and withdrawal and actual case of addiction. So the criticism of his work is sometimes he's accused of minimizing the risk, and I think it's a really important caveat is taking any substance, of course, comes with risks and consequences. His view is more that, well, it's not to say that they're naturally and inevitably addictive, but rather that, as with any substance, such as more socially accepted substances such as alcohol, there are significant risks. And if you decide to drink from morning to evening, you are going to pay a very big price for that, and your life is going to resemble that. Same with any type of substance you might find. Okay, so that's Dr. Hart. That's the more controversial, provocative view on substances themselves, especially drugs. And we'll move to the work of Johann Hari, who's really, I'm a big fan of his. I think he's got some really interesting insights into mental health, and he's done some work on dependency and addiction as well. And a lot of this was in his book, Case Stream, where he did this international tour to experts, people in the field, and people who were recovering from dependency, and kind of put it all together. So it's a very, very recommended book. One of the most interesting experiments that he speaks about is this rat cage, rat park. So he didn't do this. This was done before. And it's in many ways is one of the most formative experiments for how we think about drugs, but also one of the most overlooked in terms of its overall conclusions. So this experiment was done on rats. I think it was done in the 90s, but I stand to be corrected on that. But it done a little while ago, a number of decades ago. Done on rats, and it gave them the option of cocaine. So what they did is they laced water in these rat cages with cocaine, and essentially what they found was that if they put these rats in a rat cage, just a kind of very bare cage, not much else. There was food, there was normal water, and then there was cocaine laced water. What would happen is that the rats would increasingly use the water with cocaine in it, to the point where they would eventually die. So they would become so dependent on it, then eventually it would be such overdose that they would eventually kill themselves. This is one of many in the long history of really kind of quite troubling animal experiments that psychology has done for many years, but that's a completely different story. But the takeaway from that is pretty much feeding into this classic story of addiction, which is if you are dependent on something, you will probably use it to your detriment until your life eventually falls apart, and then maybe even you die, and you will be powerless to stop it. What they found, though, that's the kind of classic takeaway from this classic experiment. But that the experiment didn't end there, and this is the underreported part of it. The second part is when they took rats and they made these cages into what they call something more like a rat park, which is they had companions. It wasn't just one rat in a cage. They had all sorts of recreational things. They had the rat wheels, master wheels. They had all sorts of toys they could play with. It was just a much more stimulating environment for what you might imagine a rat is going to be looking for. Then the rat did not use the water-based cocaine to the point of death, but they made much more, let's say in inverted commas, wiser choices about their use of substance. And the takeaway here is that their lives were fuller, they were less isolated, and so they didn't turn to the substances to the point where they actually ended up killing themselves. And I think this is a really, really profound finding. What it speaks to, which we can find in humans as well, more developed mammals than rats, is we have this very deep evolutionary need for social connection and bonding. And it's often when people are feeling socially isolated, disconnected, that they are vulnerable to addiction. And you can see this playing out in this rat cage versus the rat park. The rats that were isolated and unhappy and unstimulated, they were the rats that were more likely to end up in addictive dynamics. Addiction, I should say, whether it's substances or behaviors, can replace this connection that we crave. And it's one of these really fragile spirals that we find in mental health, is when we start to replace something healthy with something that's unhealthy, it starts to separate us even more from the healthy part. So people who are finding themselves caught in these spirals of drug use because they're very socially isolated, lonely or disconnected from people. Then they start to use the substance more, and because of that, their relationships start to suffer. The people in their lives start to leave them and fall away, and the only quality, the only relationships they have left are low quality relationships. Then they find themselves at the mercy of the criminal justice system, and they get put in prison. They get put in their own cages and isolated even more, and this makes them even more at risk of relapse and everything else that comes. So you can see what a key aspect human connection is in this story, and how disconnection socially can then be a risk factor for dependence. And this again is saying there's a lot more than just a chemical process going on there. It's not about that. Perhaps the people who are disconnected socially are less likely going to be able to make the choice to say, I choose not to have this thing because the cost is too high. And of course, what this means is that addiction is not just about narcotics and substances, it's about behaviors and other substances as well. So coffee can be addictive. I mean, you can probably have quite a lot of coffee before it starts becoming problematic for you. I think the lethal dose of coffee is about 60 cups in a day. I drink a fair amount of coffee, and I never get anywhere near to that. Biggest the science seems to show right now that the biggest downfall for coffee is its effect on your sleep, and sleep is becoming such an important aspect in mental health, physical health. I say it's becoming one. I mean, really, it has been forever, but the awareness is one that's growing. So the biggest price one tends to pay for coffee is that it starts to interfere with your sleep. So if you're drinking coffee after midday, that's a behavior that should probably be looked into or switch to decaf. So social media is hugely addictive, of course, and it's because it's kind of tricking the reward motivational systems in our brain. It's getting those dopamine hits. The algorithms are really, really clever at doing that, and it hijacks us. Our old brains are just unable to cope with all these new temptations. And yeah, people become dependent on social media and the escape that comes with it. If you think about it, it's the same thing, which is temporary pleasure and avoidance of having to think, avoidance of the pain that can come with being present with our thoughts. Shopping, retail therapy. This is a joke, the idea of retail therapy, but there is an aspect of it. Often people who are completely feeling overwhelmed, burnt out in their life, their spending starts to become more impulsive, and they have less control over it, and they start paying a significant price for it. Things arrive that the high of something arriving it's just not doing it anymore, so more and more starts to arrive. And online shopping is really facilitating a lot of this in a lot of people's lives as well. Gambling, of course, this is once again hijacking the reward systems in our brains. The idea of getting some type of reward, we are really focused on that. You can see how that will be helpful to our ancestors. They're wandering around the forest to find something. You think it's something, it's not. Open, you pick up a nut, it's not a nut, and then you pick up something and say, well, this is really valuable food, it's going to help me, I can take it back to family. And then you kind of have this dopamine hit. The gambling process is replicating that very basic hunter-gatherer motivation that we had before. This is why often it's the fact that gambling is so inconsistent. We kind of, when you're pushing the button on the slot machine, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, something kind of happens, nothing happens, and then it's a hit. That's really, really effective at triggering those aspects of us. Sexual behaviors, of course, there's a lot that comes with this. Often it's a craving for just connection as well. It's not necessarily about, most of the time, it's not about the physiological pleasure, but it's about psychological performance, control, power, validation, connection that comes through that. Work. This is something that people find very, very intoxicating, because often when lives feel chaotic and out of control, and there's not many good things going on at home, work can be a place where there's order and structure, and also there's immediate validation. You can be good at it, you can get feedback from it, you can grow in it. That's something that can be healthy, but also can start to, you can grow a dependency on that and then start paying the price for it. Often that price is burnout. Hyper exercising, again, this is something that's not that clearly is healthy, but can become dependent as well. People start to, often in these manic phases, they hyper exercise and focus so much on exercise, and they actually start to develop an unhealthy relationship with that. Video games is a really, really big one these days, and it's about video games. Obviously, these are just any type of computer games, any type of device that you're playing these games, that they're really clever these days as well in terms of the storyline, feedback, and how you play them to kind of get you hooked. Now people are spending huge portions of their lives in these virtual spaces. And this, again, often disconnects people, especially young people. It disconnects them from the social protective factors that are there and makes them more vulnerable to then leaning more into the escape that comes with that. You can see the common theme through many of these things that one might become dependent on is this idea of escape. And that is a psychological process going on, the idea that we need to escape. Food as well. It's well documented, our relationship with food, and how that is often a way of exerting control in a life that feels like we're powerless. So the final expert I want to take you through, I will take you through a bit of his work. You might have heard of it before. His name is Dr. Gabor Mate. He is Hungarian by birth. He was born in World War II Hungary. I think he was actually born in a concentration camp, if I'm not mistaken. But of course, because of that, he has a very, very interesting story, and his parents have a very interesting story, and how they parented him and was very much affected by these experiences, very, very traumatic experiences in occupied Hungary back in the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s. He's now living in Canada, and he has really, really interesting work. He's a physician, but he's written a number of books on these ideas. He's worked a lot with addicts in city centers, and his model is something along the lines of what we call a biopsychosocial model. So yes, there is the biological aspect, but there's also the psychological aspect. How do we understand addiction? By taking into account all three of these, not just making it biological, not just making it psychological, but kind of understanding the full complicated picture there. So his thesis is something along the lines of the things that addictive substances and behaviors give us is escape from emotional pain. Anything that can make us not feel emotional pain, we're more likely to gravitate towards. Some type of peace of mind. So you can think about peace as how intruded upon are we by our thoughts and by the pain that we carry. How intruded are we psychologically on ourselves from our past? How does our past kind of suddenly appear in our life in really uncomfortable ways? How at peace with our past are we? And how at peace with our future are we? How much anxiety do we have about the uncertain future? How many strategies do we try to develop in order to protect ourselves from a painful past or scary future? That absence of peace of mind in those different realms means you're more likely to find something that takes that pain away from the past or the worry about the future, just to quieten everything down. And then a temporary sense of happiness or euphoria, that moment of feeling everything is okay. I'm actually feeling a type of happiness that I wouldn't be able to feel in my life without the substance or behavior. And then, of course, control as well, to feel like I have some control over my life. And that's a really, really basic human need, to feel the psychological need for having some type of control in our lives. Dr. Mate, he suggests that these substances or abuses are giving us, they're checking these boxes. You can see how powerful that might be, and how the search for that might be increasingly dependent on the lack of it, right? The more we feel overwhelmed by emotional pain, the more we feel a lack of peace in our life, the more we feel deeply, deeply unhappy, whether we're carrying pain or trauma, the more we feel out of control and vulnerable, and like we don't have agency in our lives, the more likely we are to be at risk of dependency. So then it's not about the substance or the behavior, but what is your existence like when you are sober? What is it like to be you in your conscious state? What is it like to inhabit your life? You can imagine someone who has everything in their lives, and everything in inverted commas, you checks all the boxes. They have the job and the wife and family, partner, whatever it might be, the children, money, but they're deeply, deeply unhappy. That person is the type of person who is likely to become dependent. And it's more about what is happening in that person's psyche and psychological state. You can imagine someone who doesn't have all of those things living on the streets and is also deeply, deeply unhappy and looking for some type of escape. The escape is not so much from the material aspects of one's life, but more about the conscious, what are the psychological aspects, what is it like to be me in my life right now when I'm sober and I'm just dealing with my thoughts and my feelings. How painful is that default experience to be me? And that'll tell you significantly about how likely someone is to fall into dependent patterns because of the need to escape from the pain that might just be there running all the time. So there's no such thing as an addictive personality. This is a very pervasive myth of psychology. People always say this, I've got an addictive personality, or this person has an addictive personality. I don't want to ever try that because I have an addictive personality. Essentially, what you're saying, if you say that, is I find myself gravitating to things that take me away from me. It's not so much a personality, but more a strategy for dealing with unbearable discomfort in the present. And if that is me, then yes, I probably couldn't try anything which is going to give me a high sense of euphoria or make me feel very, very, very disconnected from my pain, because then I'm more likely to find myself indulging in that. You can see this kind of balance between how painful is it just to be us, to be conscious in the present, and how attractive is this idea of taking that away. And when the pain starts to become more, then we start to become so addiction ultimately through this model is a problem-solving technique. It's a way of solving a certain problem. What is this problem? Well, it's about regulating our internal states through external means. So I want to feel a certain way, and there are external solutions that I have found to that problem, whether it's crack cocaine, or whether it is shopping, or whether it is working. So the question then is not necessarily why the addiction. We shouldn't focus so much on the substance. We shouldn't focus so much on the addiction itself, but we should be asking, why am I hurting so much? Why is this person hurting so much? Where is their pain coming from? The point of intervention should be on the pain, not on the dependency itself. And almost all addictive behavior, we find roots in childhood trauma or childhood adversity or something going on there that causes the original pain, the original wounds, and then the strategy that one has to develop for dealing with the original trauma, which is, avoidance of our emotions, avoidance of trusting people, disconnecting, and all of these things then start to lead to lives as we age that are there's a perpetuation of pain and disconnection, loneliness. And this is sometimes referred to as the dependence cycle. So what is the dependence cycle? The dependence is the dependence cycle is the spiral that we can fall into, where we escape, and because we escape, we need to escape more. So the more we need to run away from our lives, the more we start to create lives that need to be run away from. It's a very classic dependent cycle. So the more I'm drinking to 3 a.m. every morning, every day of the week, the more I'm going to wake up in the morning feeling the psychological effects of that. My mood is going to be terrible. My sleep is going to be terrible. I'm going to feel terrible about myself. And then I'm going to feel, I wasted so much money. What terrible choices did I make last night? And then I start to want to escape from that. So how do I do that? Well, I pick up a bottle and I start drinking straight first thing after work again. And then I'm in that cycle. So the more we escape from our lives, we start actually putting our lives in such a way that we would want to be it. This is one of the broader ways of treating dependency, is saying, well, let's look at your life and let's say what needs to change here to make it a life that you could feel okay being sober in, being present in. And that's about these psychological shifts as well, healing, one of them. But also just about saying, well, what's missing in my life right now that makes my life such an unhappy place to be? Because if my life feels unhappy, then I'm going to escape from it. And if I escape from it, then my life is going to be the dependence cycle. Okay, so that is the basics of dependency, substance dependency, and I hope that this gives you some different ways of thinking about these things, and different ways of thinking about what is happening psychologically when we are dependent on things. We can all find something in our lives that perhaps we depend on, and the price we're paying for it probably differs. Again, you would start to call it dependency when the price you're paying is much higher than any value you're getting from that thing. But these behaviors and dependencies exist on a continuum, of course. So hopefully having some understanding about the psychological aspects, what's going on here, is helpful for you guys. And if you're interested in looking up any of those experts as well, do so. I would highly recommend it. Let's open up to some questions. So, yes, the recording and the keynote will be shared. It'll be on the YouTube channel probably towards the end of the week. You can look out for that. Any questions or comments? Give me your thoughts on this. I'm interested in if this challenged anything that you thought about addiction, if you disagree with anything, if this was actually all very common sense to you and you knew all of it before. I'd be really interested in your guys' perspectives on that. We have a few minutes, so yeah, let me open up the floor for any of those comments or questions. Okay, yes, Myla, I see there is a hand. You are welcome to talk. You are unmuted. Yeah, at least you have to unmute.
Yes, how are you?
Well, thank you. How are you?
Yes, yeah. I want to speak in relation to exercising. You spoke about exercising being addicted to. How so? Because we thought to exercise is about a healthy living style. So how it come to be an addiction?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, I would say that the truth is you would have to go pretty far before it starts to become something that is problematic, that you're paying a significant price for it. But with a lot of these substances and behaviors, some type of um, some type of healthy use is not problematic, of course. It's only once you start to go further down the frequency and intensity of it that starts to become problematic. And depending on what the substance is, you might find you reach that point sooner or later. And with exercise, you'd probably reach it. You'd have to do a lot of exercise before you actually start paying a significant price for it. But of course, there are really, someone once said about exercise, if you could get the benefits from exercise in terms of increased mood, those euphoric feelings, better concentration, problem solving, you sleep better, your skin is better. All of these really significant physiological and psychological benefits. If you could put that in a pill, people would pay a million rand for that pill. But of course, it's free, So there's a huge amount of benefits you get from it. But because there are psychological benefits, sometimes people find themselves so hyper exercising that they're doing it to a point that actually starts to become unhealthy. And again, your use would have to be quite significant before you get there. But people do use it as a way of, it is possible to develop an unhealthy relationship with exercise where you're putting on so much pressure on yourself, you're doing it so much of the time, that you start to actually become dependent on it as an escape again from life. That's the type of condition when it would potentially be categorized as. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Much
Don't
appreciated.
me. I'm not saying you shouldn't exercise. I'm a very strong advocate of it. I really think the benefits. But yeah, I'm glad you asked for some clarity.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. A lot of people replace alcohol with exercise. Yeah, that can be helpful as well. Right. That can certainly be helpful to replace alcohol with exercise. Often when you are replacing a substance that you have become dependent on or a behavior, that is helpful to replace something that is healthier for you. But yeah, again, you can get to the point where it could be problematic. Arno, can this be part of social circles that people want to be part of the crowd? Yeah, yes, but again, that by itself is not enough, right? So if you are so influenced by your peers, that probably says something about a deep need that you have for acceptance. We all have a need for a sense of belonging. That's a very normal human need. There's nothing wrong with that. But if that need is so strong that you're sacrificing your own well-being for it, then there's probably something going on there that's worth looking at. But yeah, social circles count as one. Often behaviors are normalized, right? So being around certain people might normalize certain types of behavior that are not healthy, and that might be part of the risk factor as well for dependency. a good point there, Anna. Okay, I am a recovering addict. I've always knew that my addiction problem was rooted in childhood traumas and inequalities. I'm now trying to adopt new habits, running, reading, just being outside. It affects most parts of my life, including my relationship too. Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for that comment and your vulnerability there. And I think you're telling such a normal and common story, is that childhood traumas are significant, to state the obvious. We often think, I think the model we sometimes have, maybe we have it less these days, but I come across it a lot, which is the things that happen in our past happen in our past. And we just don't think about them, deal with them, and we can just kind of get on with life and they will go away. And over and over again, people realize it doesn't work that way. When we go through significant pain early in our lives, we do have to find ways, or we often don't find ways of dealing with that pain in a healthy way, and often start to become addiction. Yeah, so that's I really appreciate that comment from you. And I think the point about adopting new habits is so key as well. Running, reading, being outside, these are so good for mental health. And again, the challenge overwhelmingly is just to create a life that it's okay to be in, that you don't need to escape from. And that is a process that happens over time. Again, it's internal, psychological, it's about mindset, beliefs, it's about emotional regulation, and it's also about the material factors of our life. Thank you so much for that comment. Maile, I see you've raised your hand. The floor is yours. You can still talk.
Yes. I just want to know, does peer pressure lead to substance abuse? You'll find this a group of teenagers happen to engage themselves in your crystal, whatever substance abuse has been in place in the market. Could it be the lead or the cause?
Certainly is part of the story. And teenagers are especially vulnerable, of course. And there's a kind of double-edged sword that happens there. They're especially vulnerable. I mean, for a male, your prefrontal cortex doesn't get fully developed, probably mid-20s, 25 or so. That's the point where that's the part of your brain where all the higher order decision-making, rational thinking comes from. So teenagers are very vulnerable, very reckless, but they're also significant risk takers at the same time. So it's a very developmentally risky period. And one of the risks, of course, is that adolescents are very vulnerable to social pressures, right? Being alienated, ostracized as an adolescent is worse than death. You just want to kind of fit in and be the same as everybody else. And so, yeah, sometimes that means substance use as well. And that kind of goes with the recklessness, sense of invincibility, the experimentation, the risk taking, all of those things happen, and peer pressure can certainly be a part of that. So yeah, I mean, it is something that needs to. It's not something that adolescents can be protected from completely. You can't put them in a solitary confinement, but giving them the skills and the ability to be able to make as good choices about their lives as possible, and knowing that you're not going to be perfect, they're not going to be perfect at that is really important. So yeah, the peers that an adolescent is associating with is certainly relevant.
Yeah, maybe to add more with regard to peer pressure and social media too, behavioral intelligence, it does have a negative impact on these teenagers. While they are growing up, they keep themselves busy with their phones, especially in the social media, engaging one another. It's where maybe it leads to what we are facing recently than in ancient history. Back then, a teenager, they were humbled, but today's teenagers, it's a chaotic.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the cause of substance abuse.
I think definitely those things are connected. Yeah, I think social media is really it's not good for young people. It's not good for old people as well, but it's specifically not good for young people. And that's the research there is quite clear, especially things like Instagram and teenage girls and self-harm. The links between those are really scary. So yeah, I mean, when mental health is deteriorating, dependency will be more likely. That is a significant risk factor. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Two notes in terms of the peer or the replacement and peer pressure. So Anna Maria, replacement is not the answer. Sometimes a way out for those who want to stop an addiction. Fast away with the known outcome, just an observation. Yeah, I think by itself, you're right, replacement is not necessarily going to do it. I think there's a deeper intervention that can be necessary. But that said, there are aspects of replacing or changing one's lifestyle in a certain way that can increase the likelihood of recovery not being characterized just by relapse. But yeah, by itself, probably not enough. It's true. You have to take the problem of dependency at the severity of it. So if it's an 8 out of 10 severity and your life is affected by it, kind of 8 out of 10, where you have to make changes which are 8 out of 10 to the same degree. You can't approach that half-heartedly. And sometimes that would mean replacing certain behaviors. Sometimes it means replacing social circles as well, to go to the social point again. Yeah. Desiree, relationships with your children are important, and the friends they choose. Yeah, so important. Peers are hugely important for children and their development. And again, there's a lot of research that shows that they're almost more important than parents in the absence of adverse parenting conditions. So provided your parenting is just kind of run-of-the-mill, you're not doing any specific damage, there's no excessive conditions there, the research tends to show that who your children choose as their peers, where they go to school, is probably going to be even more influential on the people they become. So yeah, couldn't agree more with that.